Hello, today we welcome Dimitris Xygalitas to the Inner Sense channel. Dimitris is an anthropologist and cognitive scientist who specializes in studying some of the more peculiar aspects of human nature, such as ritual, music, and sports fanship. His research combines experimental methods with field work to study human culture holistically. And today, I hope that we can talk about some of his studies on Spanish firewalking rituals and the interesting observations that he's made about how the self-reported levels of arousal from participants in these rituals correlates to what's been measured, as well as the synchrony between people at these events. So I'm really keen to hear from Dimitris how we may be able to embrace some of these ritualistic practices for biobehavioral synchrony and how these may help people to mitigate against chaotic times. So please remember to subscribe to the Inner Sense channel for more of this type of information, as well as research about interoception and body awareness. Thank you for joining us, Dimitris.
Thank you for the invite. Great to be with you.
And I've been looking forward to this interview for a long time, and I enjoyed reading your book, Ritual, and I hope that we can cover some of the work that was covered in that book. But please, can we start by hearing a little bit more about your background and career journey that led to you researching ritualized behavior at the University of Connecticut?
Yeah, so I grew up in Greece, and ever since I've lived in 6 more countries. So my scholarly interests took me all over the world. But one thing that has remained constant for me is the curiosity about ritual and some of the other kinds of things that make us human, but they're not the very obvious ones. Mm-hmm. They're the kinds of things that upon first glance, they might seem pointless, senseless, irrational even. But these are the kinds of things that people find deep meaning in. Things like ritual, things like music and dancing, things like sports affiliation. And this is a fascination that started for me ever since my late childhood. So growing up in Greece, this was a very religious environment. Greece consistently in surveys shows up to be one of the most religious countries in the West. Mm. But my family never pushed religion on me, and they weren't really practicing. So I was always puzzled by looking at other people's practices. Especially, I was puzzled by the kinds of stuff that I would read on National Geographic, faraway, exotic rituals, seemingly exotic, until I realized that these are the kinds of things that people do everywhere, including my own society. So that eventually, that curiosity led me to become an anthropologist. And it brought me first to Denmark as a graduate student, and then to Queen's University Belfast as a PhD student. And from there, I went on to do fieldwork in the northern Mediterranean, southern Europe, as well as in the Indian Ocean, a tiny island called Mauritius. And the common thread in all of those things has been my focus on ritual.
So, yeah, very, very interesting to hear how your curiosity from your own life has kind of led you to, or you formed your career around what you witnessed in your home country. So let's start off with sort of defining rituals. What are rituals, and how do we distinguish between a ritual and something else repetitive like a habit or a routine?
Yeah, that's a great question. So habits and ritual may share many structural similarities. For example, there are things that are performed routinely and repetitively, but there are some fundamental differences there. The way I see it, a habit is taking something that has a clear functional purpose and turning into something routine so that we can perform it in a mindless way. Mm-hmm. So brushing our teeth is a perfect example of that. A ritual, on the other hand, is taking something that seems to be non-functional, has no direct goal, and turning it into something meaningful. So when people go to a temple, when people invest a lot of time and effort in preparing a holiday meal, these are things that are deeply meaningful, and yet all of the paraphernalia of those, the ritualized aspect of this, the fact that we might dance around the table before eating, for example, they don't seem to have any direct function. So this lack of any stated purpose, or even when there is a stated purpose, the lack of direct causality. So when we perform a rain ritual, our dancing about does not cause rain to fall from the sky. That is what makes an action ritual.
And in your book, I really like the example you mentioned brushing teeth there, and I liked in the book that you explained that the causal relationship between brushing teeth and having a clean mouth is obvious, but if someone took a kind of a fake sort of brush and started waving it around in the air, they wouldn't expect that to make their teeth clean. However, if that action was done in a ritualistic setting, maybe with a group of people, there would possibly be some beneficial outcome for the group, but not necessarily related to cleaning their mouth, having a clean mouth, but there may be some well-being benefit.
Exactly, and this is one of the key insights that we derive from studying ritual. That to say that ritual does not have any direct causal influence on the world is not to say that it doesn't have any effect at all. In fact, rituals have very important effects, both on our individual psychology, our collective existence and identity, and our search for meaning. And these are the kinds of effects that I seek to document in this book.
So I'm really keen on the physiological changes that can be measured, and then maybe we can talk about some of your studies in more detail. But what kinds of physiological changes occur during ritual or ceremonies?
So I think here it will be interesting. It will be useful to draw a distinction between two types of rituals: rituals that whose main outcome is to soothe individuals, and rituals whose main outcome is to excite individuals. Mm-hmm. So we have rituals, mainly individual rituals, and ritualization. By ritualization, I mean behavior that is repetitive and rigid and very structured, but might be, so it's more spontaneous, and usually it's the kind of stuff that we find at the individual level. They're not necessarily shared collective cultural rituals, but they might be the kinds of things that people do at the casino, or they might the kinds of things that some might call superstitions among athletes. And there's a very well-documented relationship between those types of behaviors and anxiety. So first of all, we see that if you want to observe these kinds of ritualized actions spontaneously, some of the best places to go to are the stadium, the casino, or perhaps a war zone or a hospital, wherever people face high stakes and high levels of uncertainty. And the reason behind this is that our mind constantly makes predictions about the world. When we drive, we have to anticipate where every other car is going to be a few seconds from now. And when I'm talking to you, your brain is already making a prediction about how my sentence is going to end. You could anticipate this word, right? And this is a very useful cognitive architecture. It's a very efficient. Our brain is a very efficient computational device. But one downside of this is that when we don't have the capacity to make a lot of predictions, we experience anxiety. That's when we call uncertainty. Mm-hmm. When there are natural disasters, you don't know if there's going to be an aftershock after the earthquake. When there's a war, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. At a sports game, other people are competing, so it doesn't depend on you. When you're gambling, nothing depends on you. So those are exactly the kinds of situations, or illness, for example, where we feel stressed. And we see that in those situations, people become more ritualized. We can also see that experimentally. So when we brought people into a lab and we stressed them up, we had them engage in things like public speaking in front of a panel of experts. So when they're faced with this task, people get very stressed. And then we use motion sensors to measure their behavior. And we see that their behavior becomes more ritualistic. more repetitive, more rigid, more patterned. So does this work? And we have studies that show that it does work. For example, we collected hormonal samples among college students at the University of Connecticut, and we found that the more collective rituals they take part in, the lower their anxiety levels. We also collected heart rate variability measurements. So this is a response of the autonomic system that is related to our ability to cope with stress. Higher variability shows lower levels of stress. And we went into religious temples, Hindu temples in Mauritius, and we saw that after performing these repetitive rituals that they perform in those temples, the locals had low levels of anxiety compared to others who didn't perform those rituals.
Mm.
So this is one aspect of the effects of ritual, the soothing aspect. Then, of course, we have other types of rituals that they're more extravagant, more exciting ones, and that's a whole different story.
So this soothing aspect, it's a kind of the ritual is a practice, almost like a training wheel for a person individually or collectively to learn how to self-soothe, how to gear their physiology towards a state of calm. And this is done, if they've done this practice many times in the past, when it comes to a situation where, as you said, there's lots of uncertainty or the potential for levels of anxiety to rise, they can use this practice to evoke a feeling of calm in that situation.
Yes, and the reason this works is that it gives us a sense of control, a sense of predictability. Because if ritual is anything, it is structure and it is predictability. We know exactly what to do. We know exactly when to do it. And this is, so to speak, a mental technology, a tool that we can use to soothe our anxieties. This is not unique to humans even. We see that if you capture a wild animal and you put it in a cage, it will start engaging in those repetitive patterns.
Licking and all of this.
Or maybe walking the same path back and forth. And this is similar to what we do. When we're stressed, we might pace back and forth. We might fidget. All of those things that are natural responses to stress, what they have in common is structure. They're very repetitive. And cultures help us expand this into more elaborate sequences of things like prayer, things like collective rituals, that they have more elaborate sequences of actions that they too are very predictable, and they give us a sense of control and predictability. And it doesn't really matter whether this control is real or illusory. Obviously, fidgeting or performing a ritual is not going to help me face my it's not going to make my stressor go away. The natural disaster or the war, for example. Excuse me. But it might help me reduce my anxiety, which allows me to function better. There are studies, for example, that show among athletes, when they perform rituals before things like shooting free throws or batting, they perform better. And if you disrupt those rituals, then they perform worse. And this doesn't happen through any kind of miraculous, magical causation. It happens because they're able to boost their confidence.
We had David Robson on this channel, who wrote The Expectation Effect, book The Expectation Effect, and he's got a chapter in his book on this similar thing of sports professionals who have rituals, and he described them. And he, after learning about that, he decided to create a ritual for himself before he begins writing, because he's a science writer. So he did one where he counts out his coffee beans into into the coffee grinder or whatever he did. And he said, he counts out exactly 15, and he uses that for his to guide him into a state of focus for writing. So well, maybe we can touch on this right at the end, but I'm really curious. I love how you've drilled down and found the common thread, or the common sort of physiological measurable aspects and the recognizable features amongst all of these rituals. And you said that it doesn't matter that, as long as the soothing effect happens, it doesn't matter about what happens with the situation. I've got a question at the end that I'd like to maybe return to about when rituals become maybe problematic or unhelpful. Maybe in a cult type situation where the society or the group loses touch or with what is going on around them, or it leads to some sort of conflict. But we'll come back to that maybe. In your book, there was a quote by the scholar Catherine Bell, who defined ritual as a culturally strategic way of acting in the world. So you've kind of touched on this already when you said that animals kind of do this to self-soothe. So do you think we've evolved these practices as a kind of almost a necessity, really? Can you imagine a situation where we don't have these tools?
No, this would be a different species. So when you ask anthropologists about human universals, there will be there are very few things that they will agree upon, that they're true human universals. But ritual is one of those things. There's never been a society, whether past or present, that we know of, that didn't have rituals. And in fact, when you go back in time, you see that when archaeologists are trying to define a particular species as human or not, one of the things they might look at is burials. So because ritual is related to our capacity for symbolic thought. And in fact, the more we know about our nearest relatives, the more we see that they too practice rituals. So until recently, we might have thought that other apes don't have rituals. Now we have plenty of evidence. Jane Goodall already mentions that chimps have these waterfall dances. So they seem to be awestruck at the sight of a waterfall, and they have this collective dance in front of it. And she wonders there whether this might not evoke some of the feelings that are somehow similar to what people experience in religious ceremonies. Now, of course, we don't know what's in their minds, but when we observe some of these rituals, it's very clear that if we saw these in a group of humans, we would definitely talk about spirituality. Another example, more recent, is that chimpanzees in West Africa were found in multiple locations. They were filmed visiting these trees that, again, if this is something that you see a group of humans do, you would readily call this sacred trees. Now, we don't know what's going on in their minds, but there's no doubt that this is a ritual. They visit those trees and they carry rocks with them, and they use them to drum on the trees, and they also pile them up in front of the trees, much like these cairns that you have in many human societies. So we see that ritual goes deep into our evolutionary lineage.
As you're talking about that and the cairns, I'm thinking about, there's this term I learned from the Active Inference Institute called stigmergy, which is where animals, let's say ants or apes or humans, as we move through our environment, we leave markers which create a path for people. And I know the cairns in Scotland, they're used by hikers to see where the path to the summit is. But it's so that there is a kind of a causal outcome for other people who follow. But the practice, if you look at it as piling up stones, it does seem very just ritualistic.
Yes, and especially in some contexts, you will see that in some cultures, people do this in very particular spaces, which typically have some religious significance. Of course, one reason to do that might be to just mark the path for a hiker. But when chimps do this for a particular tree, you would presumably they don't do it to mark the location for other chimps. They do it because there's some kind of importance to them.
Yeah, and it's reminded me in the book you talked about this concept of fission and fusion of social animals. They can come together, fuse together, and then go apart. And I guess there has to be something that maintains the fusion as well.
Yes, and again, this is something we see in us, of course, but we see in other primates. And we don't think about things like handshakes. We don't typically, if I ask you to name a few rituals, typically handshakes are not one of those things that come to mind. But that's what a handshake is. It is a ritual. There's no obvious purpose to it. It turns out other animals too have equivalent things. So various apes and monkeys, because they live in similar kinds of societies where the individuals will get away from the group for a while and then will come back together. They have ways of strengthening bonds. So people have argued that perhaps the origins of the handshake have something to do with trust. So I signal that I don't have a weapon. I'm giving you my hand. I'm vulnerable. As it turns out, baboons have this similar greeting where they grasp each other's genitals. And in fact, there are some human societies who do the same thing as a greeting, and it is a signal of trust. Of course, some other species might put their fingers inside a conspecific's mouth, which again, that's very vulnerable, a very vulnerable position to be in, because you could get bitten. It signals trust, and we have similar ritualized ways of showing that trust and affection.
Yeah, offering up your genitals certainly is a vulnerable position to be in. And I'm thinking about, pet dogs as well. When they're happy or feel safe, then they roll on their back and expose their abdomen, don't they? Which again is a vulnerable area. So thanks for explaining about the difference between the types of rituals which soothe versus arouse. And can we talk a little bit now about your studies on Spanish firewalking rituals? Because they certainly appear arousing from if you've ever watched them. I've done one myself, not in Spain, but as part of a company that does them for business training and team building and confidence and so on. So you've made some interesting observations between how the participants report their state, their inner state, and also about the synchrony between people at the event. So how do you study this in an academic way? And I'm aware you make use of heart rate variability devices as well. So what's going on in these types of studies?
The idea behind these types of studies was emerged both from anthropological theory, but also from what people were telling me, because I had been studying firewalking rituals for a very long time. That was the topic of my doctoral dissertation. So I had talked to people who performed these rituals in Greece, in Bulgaria, and in Spain. And time and again, people would talk about this sense of oneness that they experienced. They would say things like, when you go up there might be thousands of people looking at you, but you feel like one. And the next day you see somebody in the streets and you've been through this thing together and you feel like brothers. Even if you weren't particularly friendly with that person before, now having had this shared experience makes you like brothers. And these statements sounded like they were straight out of an anthropological textbook. People like Emil Durkheim had described this phenomenon that he called collective effervescence. In his view, those high-intensity rituals were fundamental, not just for the birth of religion, but also for the birth of society. In his view, in the context of those rituals, when people came together to feast and then dance together and act together in a highly arousing way, they came to feel like one. When you act like one, you feel like one. And that, for Durkheim, was the instance where our ancestors changed from just a group of individuals to an actual community. But this is an elusive concept. How do we measure this, the feeling of collective effervescence, of oneness? So what we decided is that, if this is true, if rituals lead to the alignment of emotional states, then we should be able to observe this in their bodies. So one indicator of arousal is heart rate. So we used portable sensors. At the time, this was state-of-the-art technology. We were lucky enough to have wearable sensors at that time. And we went into the context of a firewalking ritual in Spain, which is a really extraordinary ritual. I've seen firewalking rituals in all parts of the world, both religious and secular, like the one you described, but nothing like that. I mean, the Spaniards use 2 tons of oak wood, and oak burns at a very high temperature. So we measured that temperature at over 700 Celsius, which is enough to melt aluminum, by the way. And on that fire, people will take off their shoes and they will carry somebody on their back, a beloved one, and they will walk through that fire. Just standing in front of that fire at a good distance, maybe 10 meters away, makes you feel like you're inside an oven and you're getting roasted. We were worried about the equipment. So actually our pyrometer, a device that is specifically designed to measure extreme temperatures, started melting after we measured the surface temperature. That's how hot it is. And that context is, that ritual is obviously the most important event in the life of that community. There are 600 people living in that village, and there are 3,000 spectators that come every year. They have built this amphitheater to host them. They only use it once a year for that event. Every single person told us that this is the most important moment in the year. So in that context, we had firewalkers as well as spectators wear those monitors. And what we found a lot of fascinating things. So one of the things you mentioned in your opening statement was that sometimes our perceived inner states might not match with measured inner states. So the first thing we found is that when we asked people to predict their level of arousal, they knew what we meant because they were wearing the monitors. Some people challenged me to bet money. They said, I bet you I had a lower heart rate during the firewalk than now that I'm talking to you during the baseline measurements. Every single person said they were very calm during the firewalk, except our measurements showed that some of them had 240 beats per minute, levels that I never thought were possible in healthy adults. So extreme levels of arousal. And that has important implications. We might get into that later. But in terms of the synchrony, we find that during this ritual, people's heart rates begin to synchronize. Not only those of the firewalkers, because if we all dance together, we engage in the same movements, our heart rates will go up and down at similar rates. Mm-hmm. But here we have some people walking, some people preparing for their walk, others sitting down, and others just watching from the terraces. And what we see is that there's synchrony between all of these people, but only the insiders. So those tourists who came to watch the ritual out of curiosity, they don't get the same level of synchrony. In fact, when we mapped the social network of this group, we asked everybody to tell us who they were related to, who their friends were, and we see that the social proximity can predict physiological synchrony. So the closer you are to somebody, the stronger those empathic reactions are. So this is not just this automatic effect. We know that if we see somebody suffer, we can feel physical pain. If you see somebody break a bone, it feels painful to you. But this goes beyond that. This is not enough here. What we're seeing is not just this automatic mirroring of emotional states. We see a fundamentally social effect. And this is an effect that we have explored in other studies as well.
Mm. So if I'm to understand you correctly, then for a normal empathic response or for an average empathic response, like, I don't know, if I'm watching a Hollywood movie, I might get tearful at an emotional moment. That's a kind of normal empathic response. Mm-hmm. Whereas in this case, it's only the people who are closely related to the firewalkers who get the most synchrony. But I guess the interesting thing is that maybe you'd expect the firewalker to be physiologically aroused because they're doing something active, whereas the person watching is standing still, I'm guessing, as well, and they're further away, so they're not going to be as hot. So what do you think, what is the mechanism different than, let's say I'm watching a movie? Or is it the similar mechanism?
Not all too different. So it depends. So perhaps an example of this would be watching a movie where some of the audience are mere spectators unrelated to the events unfolding in the movie, where the other, let's say you're watching a war movie and you're watching a battle scene, and half of the audience has actually been to that, has taken part in that battle. That has deep meaning for them. It's not the same kinds of reactions that they would get, the same level of empathy that they would have. Another way of putting it would be, from my own experience, I'm a football fan. And when I go to the stadium, whenever I'm back in Greece and I have the opportunity, I go to my home team's stadium. And when I chant with 30,000 people, I get goosebumps at the back of my neck. I've been to bigger stadiums. I've been to Camp Nou in Barcelona. I didn't get goosebumps. This was a bigger crowd. There was also synchronous chanting, but it's not the same experience because this is not my group. So that's a fundamental part of the experience.
Mm. And so, okay, so you've got that familiarity and the buy-in to the team that you support. With the fire walking participants, the observers, the family observers who are closely related to the people fire walking, do they have to have experienced fire walking themselves, or could they just be like a youngish child who's never fire walked before?
They could be. This was not one. So I'm assuming that having experienced the firewalk will intensify this effect further. But we also saw that amongst people who had never firewalked themselves. And in fact, in other studies, we looked at the implications of this. So can we see those effects trickle down or up, perhaps, to actual behavior? So we went to the island of Mauritius, where I have been studying one of the most painful rituals in the world. This is the Thaipusam Kavadi. It involves impaling oneself with needles and skewers and hooks and dragging these large chariots. Meanwhile, you're carrying these gigantic structures that can weigh over 60 kilos for about 6 hours, barefooted on the burning asphalt under the tropical midsummer sun. It's a whole day of self-imposed torture.
I think you said in the book that some participants there was one who had several hundred piercings done in his back.
Yes, the most we have seen was 600. All parts of the body, except for the genitals, are covered in needles.
Wow.
So imagine that in this context, we wanted to see whether we're going to find that these effects of high arousal and even pain that we observed in Spain, whether they extend to actual behavior. So what we did is that we set up a charity task, and we had local people administer the task. So they didn't know it was us setting up the charity. And we collected, we invited people to donate money to the charity in various different contexts. In an everyday context outside of any temple, then right after a religious ritual that was a collective ceremony that involved chanting, and right after this very painful ritual, which is in the context of the same community at the same temple as the other ceremonies. What we find is that after participating in a collective ritual, people donate much more money to the charity. But after participating in this very painful ritual, they donate 3 times as much. Way more money. They become much more pro-social. And this effect extends not just to those who have suffered themselves, but also to their family members who have seen their beloved ones suffer. So taking part in those highly arousing, even painful ceremonies creates social cohesion, not at the level of shared emotions, but also at the level of behavior.
Generosity. Wow.
And there are other studies done in India by other researchers that show that those who do take part in those ceremonies, they are perceived as more trustworthy. They move closer to the center of the social network of the area. So those bonding effects are very real.
Wow. And does it matter? So let's say an example of when the ritual involves a lot of exertion or pain or suffering of some form. Does the story that's being narrated around that, so in the Thaipusam Kavadi, I'm aware, were they going up? Was it to the end point was to worship some sort of deity or god?
Yes, this is the temple of Lord Murugan, a Hindu god.
Oh, okay. So does it matter what the thing which is being represented? So whether, let's say, another ritual might have similar sort of suffering or physical activity, but it's something to do with the fertility of land. Does the story that this practice is formed around change the people's behavior or the physiological response at all?
It does, absolutely. So I see rituals as social technologies. And one of the reasons they're such effective social technologies is that they are able to operate in multiple levels. One of those levels being belief and ideology. And this is why we see that we have highly arousing rituals in so many different domains. in sports and in musical concerts and perhaps even college graduations, or certainly fraternity initiations, and of course religion and nationalist expressions. But you see that those rituals that are more effective in eliciting those visceral responses are the ones that are coupled with ideology.
Mm-hmm.
So whether in a religious context, whether in the context of nationalist parades, whether in the context of military initiations, belief matters, expectations matter. So the ideological coding of this experience will make it more meaningful.
And this is in the sort of closing chapter of your book. You were suggesting how we might be able to harness the power of ritual and ceremony, given what we've learned from your research and the research of others. And I'm, personally, I'm really interested in, that's one of the reasons why I set up this channel, was to help people understand the kind of physiological basis of therapies and rituals and different practices, and how that relates to interoceptive awareness quite specifically. But so I'm really keen to help people apply the learning and understanding to their everyday life. How might this ability to kind of foster and support biobehavioral synchrony in groups help us in 2023 to mitigate the effect of uncertainty, because we've got the stress of economic uncertainty with around the world, and also sustainability and climate change is a kind of thing that's causing a lot of people anxiety. So do you have any suggestions for how we could use these practices healthfully?
Yes, and particularly the coronavirus pandemic made me think a lot about these things. There has never been a better demonstration of the human need for ritual than the pandemic, where everybody lost the opportunity to take part in meaningful rituals at the time where they needed it the most. So some of the things we have learned is that in-person collective rituals are much more meaningful and impactful than virtual ones. My team and I did a study among basketball fans in Connecticut. So we followed fans for a whole year, a group of people who were watching the games in the stadium or on television in a group setting. And what we're finding is that their physiological synchrony is much higher in the stadium. Of course, the game will lead to fluctuation. A more exciting game will elicit more intense emotional reactions. But all else being equal, the experience in the stadium is fundamentally different. We saw that this physiological synchrony predicts both the experience that people have. They have a more meaningful experience watching the game, and how bonded they feel with each other. So this is something we can apply in classroom settings or in corporate settings, always keeping in mind that virtual events that are meant to be team building effects will never be as effective. They might be better than nothing, but they never be as effective. Mm. Another thought is whether we can start thinking about how to have more inclusive secular rituals, things like the state rituals or college rituals, rather than fractionating or dividing people into ever smaller groups. It's very important to try to give a sense of unity as well, and to have rituals that address the entire, let's say, academic community rather than particular parts of it.
That's a great example.
And of course, when we look at the kinds of rituals that soothe, then those can have important implications for how we treat patients. For example, I've had conversations with medical doctors who have described to me how when somebody is undergoing chemotherapy, a very important predictor for the success of that treatment is anxiety. If you're not able to control your anxiety, if you're overstressed, and of course, how could you not be, right? Then your immune system might be under too much pressure for the treatment to be effective. So what they're doing is that they're offering meditation sessions for participants and all sorts of other ways to help them reduce their anxiety. And a final suggestion might be, if we think about all of the major life transitions in our lives, all of them are shrouded in ritual. So we have what we call rites of passage, from birth to marriage to the ultimate transition, which is death, to college graduation. But there's one that isn't, and this is divorce. This is, historically, it's because divorce has been rare. Many religions have banned divorce altogether in the past, and states, or made it very difficult, especially for women, to get a divorce. But now it's ever more common, simply because people can, and more people are financially more independent. But as a result, when people go through a divorce, sometimes they feel this gap. You have this big ceremony to celebrate the union, but then when you have to dissolve that union, there's nothing.
Mm.
And there are attempts in Japan, for example, and in other places to make those kinds of rituals. Whether if it's a consensual divorce, you can bring the couple together to celebrate their, and this does more than celebrate. One thing it does is that it signals to all of your friends and acquaintances that you're now available. You've moved on. But most importantly, it signals this to yourself. It can be very hard to accept that you now have to move on after such a big change in your life. So I think this is one domain where we need more rituals.
I'm smiling there because last Saturday, my partner organized it was something called Five Rhythms, which is a dancing event in Peterborough. But the venue she booked, there was a side room for another party. And I saw someone I knew from Peterborough, the city I live in, go to that. He came in the building. I was surprised to see them. And I said, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And he said, "It's a surprise divorce party." Obviously, the people knew they were getting divorced, but they didn't know that they were having a party. So that fashion or that trend has made its way to England already.
Yes, I can see why.
But it's the first time I've actually heard someone who I know do one, apart from reading it in your book. So it's change is happening. Do you have any tips on the kind of, if someone wants to create some ritual practice, either individually or for a group or an organization, what are the key ingredients they need to think about?
So at an individual level, the first thing to say is whatever works for you, which I know is not much of an advice, but you might hear different suggestions by different people, but at the end of the day, it's whatever works for you. But you have to pay attention to some of those core ingredients of ritual. Why is ritual successful? So as far as individual ritualization comes, for example, repetition is key. Rigidity is key. Pick a structure and stick to that structure. In order to make that kind of ritual more attractive, though, it's always useful to connect it to some existing tradition. So don't reinvent the wheel. Mm-hmm. Rituals go through a process of selection. In every day, there are thousands of rituals that will be born. Most of them will perish. Some of them will survive for thousands of years. Why? Well, because they work for the people who perform them. And this is why we see that particular ritual actions, things like yoga, for example, are so successful today. Well, because they've been around for so long, and now they've been co-opted by other cultures because they also find them useful. So turn to the familiar. And the last step is try to connect them to some particular meaning. Mm. So a story. We talked about the importance of a story, right? You want to come up with a new family tradition, make it important to your family. So perhaps one year we got stuck in the snow and we couldn't celebrate Thanksgiving at home, and we had to do it at a different place. And maybe after that year, we all go to that place again every year, and that becomes our way of celebrating Thanksgiving. Just a random example here, but try to find something that has a particular story and meaning that is related to you and your family.
Mm. Great. Yeah, I like that idea of choosing something that works from the past, but acknowledging that all rituals will evolve in some way over time. Can we just check in on any downsides to fostering this kind of synchronous, especially arousing behavior or very calming behavior, and I can think of examples of when a group have kind of formed either story and a practice, and it's kind of almost disconnected them from something, or they've overlooked something in their environment as a result of that. So how do we avoid kind of dogma or unhelpful cult type behavior?
It's not easy. It's not easy because these things typically go hand in hand. So the ritual and belief are mutually reinforcing. And of course, when I refer to ritual as social technology, that also implies that, as any technology, it can be used for better and for worse. So when we talk about feelings of collective effervescence, there's that beautiful feeling that you have of being one with the crowd when you're part of a concert. You may also think that this would be similar to the kind of feeling that people felt in a Nazi rally, or a violent riot, or the members, or when people in a fraternity use a high arousal ritual to feel more bonded. People in a gang can do the same, and in fact they do. Initiation rituals are very popular among gangs. So I don't know if that there's a way around it other than to always try to be inclusive with our rituals. So because if you make any kind of group is defined by who is in it just as much as it is defined by who is not in it. So the more we segment those who participate in our rituals, the more we reinforce that feeling of us versus them. It's not easy always to think around this, but whenever we can, we should keep that in mind.
Thank you. Have you heard of the work of John Vervaeke from Toronto? He's an academic. He's become very popular on social media. He created a series. So he's a neuroscientist and philosopher. He studies ancient philosophy and religion. But he created a video series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which was for helping people who lack a sense of meaning or purpose to work through that. But what he's proposed that it'd be really helpful for us to have a kind of ecologies of practice, which sounds very much similar to what you're talking about. So mutually supportive narratives and practices which are validated or in touch with the latest sort of research. So they've got some scientific understanding to them, but also which honor these traditional wisdom traditions and practices. So I'd love to hear you two talk.
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me. For until very recently in the course of our history as a species, we've lived in tightly knit communities that had traditions that everybody fell in step with. And the function of those traditions was precisely to provide meaning for us. The world is changing very rapidly. For many of us, we now live in different places than when we grew up. We associate with different people than those who we did in our childhood, and those traditions, a lot of the time we reject those traditions, or we don't have anybody to practice them with. And this is why you see people seeking new forms of connection, new forms of meaning making, things like Burning Man and Coachella and political groups, or perhaps the kinds of ceremonies that we see in our secular institutions, things like college graduations, or the big birthday parties, or even the divorce rituals that we talked about. So in my mind, the human need for ritual is a constant. It is not changing. But as the more we lose the traditional ways of expressing that need and making meaning and finding community and soothing our anxieties, the more we need to find it elsewhere. And that can have benefits, but it can also have dangers.
Yeah, I think I've heard him and a few other people saying for every new tech, like physical technology, like the internet that's created, we need a new, you use the word mental technology, but I've heard them refer to them as psychotechnologies to help balance out the changes that the physical, technology has created in our culture. So I'm aware of the time, and I'd like to thank you so much for what you've shared. And before we finish, can you maybe, if there's anything else you want to share or any tips to give, and I'd love to hear also about where your research is heading, and give you the chance to say where people can find out more about your work and your book.
The only final thing to say is that it's often worth examining why certain things, even if they don't make sense to us from at first glance, why they're so meaningful to so many people. When you do see that happening, there's usually a more interesting story. And this is what my realization has been over those 2 decades that I've been studying rituals.
Thank you.
In terms of where to find me, my homepage is zigalatas.com. I have a very rare last name, so that allows me to have the domain for it. And this is a good gateway to all sorts of other links, including things I've written for broader audiences.
Great. Thank you so much. I'll include a link to that in the description for this video. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to seeing your new research unfold, and where your story and helping us understand our place in the world, how that emerges over the coming years.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Please remember to subscribe to the Inner Sense channel for more information about the role of your bodily sensations and tips for using bodily awareness to improve your well-being.